So the spirit here is that create wins on behalf of our own community. So we just couldn't call just anybody to come talk to you based on such a winning track record. We couldn't just call any old brother, sister, or so-called Negro to come and talk to you, because this long list of wins and this deep love for our own people, for our own accomplishments, and actually building the country that they try to keep us oppressed within. So I hold in my hand, as I introduce the infamous Dr. Tommy J. Curry, I'm holding up his book here. It says, The Man Not, Race, Class, Gender, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Now, family, we know we like a LeBron James. We do. You know, we outside of Baltimore, we love a Ray Lewis. You know, we outside of D.C., we love our football players and our basketball players. We love our athletes like a Michael Jordan, but we are not only the best at playing sports, we are also the best at thinking. Did you know that? Brothers and sisters, family and friends, our history go back. How long have you been here? Since. That's how long. How long you been here? Since. So based on this track record, we know we had to get one of our warrior scholars with a track record of winning. Look what Ishmael Reed, Professor Emeritus at the University of California, said about Dr. Tommy Curry. He said, Dr. Tommy Curry has written a cool, brilliant defense of the men who are the pariahs of American society. The ones who, regardless of class, find themselves at the bottom of every hierarchy. The ones whose demographics and statistics in terms of the criminal justice, healthcare, and other systems are abysmal. Countless billions have been made from the portrayal of black males as boogeymen. The Man Not is a heavy work, but the general reader will find its arguments well worth the time and effort. This book is controversial. Hey, and so is locking up black children at the age of 10 years old. That's controversial too, right? This book is controversial. Those who've dogged and stalked black men in the academy and popular culture for the past few decades are sure to have their critical knives out. Well, bring them out. We got security today. I know, but it's rare for an American intellectual to step up regardless of the fallout. This book is the one that I've been waiting for. Curry has taken the bullet for the brothers. Well, we're not taking any bullets today. Brothers and sisters, family and friends, community members, put your hands together for our brother, your brother, a warrior scholar in his own right, Dr. Tommy J. Curry! My man.
First off, thank you so much for the invitation to speak here. It's truly an honor to discuss this kind of dire situation with members from our own community. Let me begin by saying that for years, I've been conducting research on the deaths of black men and boys because I've been moved to understand how dehumanization and turning black men and boys into objects resonates so deeply with the alleged democratic ethos of the United States. We're gathered here today to think through a problem that many black scholars show disregard, if not contempt for, in American academies. And that's namely the life and well-being of black boys who are our own children. In The Man Not, I reflected upon the relief that Du Bois expressed in a chapter entitled The Passing of His Firstborn Son, where he claimed that there was a subtle happiness, if not an envy, that he had for his son not having to endure the world as a black man. When I read this piece as a young student in undergrad, it was this reflection in prose of Du Bois that made me start thinking about the relationship between death and black men, or more specifically, the shackles of black manhood that seem only to allow freedom once a black man had died. Now, in the next slide, we're confronted with some harsh facts. For those of you who are familiar with black male studies or the work of myself and Dr. Smith, you know that our emphasis is on using science, history, and theory to articulate the significance of the lives of black men and boys in the United States. Now, black men are constructed as entities of imminent threat. In perceiving the maleness of black men and boys, the apperception of the white observer transubstantiates the black men or boy into a figment of fear. This is not simply an othering. It's not simply racism or a stereotype. Black males are perceived as life-threatening entities that are not human beings. Philip Atiba-Goff and his colleagues' research in dissemination gives us a lot of support for this kind of argument. Goff found that there is a specific association between black male faces and apes that differs from general outgroup animals. So looking at face stimuli from adult white males and adult black males, Goff found that their 6 studies provided evidence of a bidirectional association between blacks and apes that can operate beneath conscious awareness and significantly influences people's perceptions and judgments. So when you see a black man, the perception that white Americans have of them is not as a human being. We constantly overlook what these threats mean for how black men are treated, how black boys are interpreted, how their actions are perceived by teachers, by law enforcement, by other people in society. Yet we pretend that when we're talking about maleness, when we're talking about the vulnerability of black boys, we're in fact just discussing bias. Next slide, please. As Harris and Fisk explained, should be another slide. Yes. As Harris and Fisk explained in their study on neuroimaging and dehumanization, members of some social groups seem to be dehumanized, at least as indicated by the absence of the typical neural signature for social cognition. That means that members of extremely stigmatized groups do not activate the medial prefrontal cortex or the area of the brain responsible for social perception. So this suggests to us that at a neurological level, some groups or people are not perceived as being capable of or able to receive social compassion. People, what we're discussing here is not simply the idea that certain people don't like black boys or men. We're not discussing the question of whether or not some people have mistaken biases or identity problems with black boys or men. It is not about that. What we're suggesting is that the very perception of black men and boys is different, as being not human, being animals, being dangerous, and perceptions are perceived as threats, fundamentally takes them out of the category of human. It says that there is no moral or ethical responsibility that we have to protecting them. In fact, we have an ethical and moral obligation in many cases to eliminate them. Next slide, please. So the association of black men and boys with danger, with threats, have become part of an underlying logic that has been described but under-theorized by many people within the academy. Threat construction, or the process of actively perceiving and acting upon an identified threat, is a trait of individuals and institutions in racist societies. So much of the threat literature in social psychology suggests that individuals, like their animal counterparts, identify threats to enhance their chances of survival and optimize their immediate environments. So these scholars theorize implicit biases and intuitions from the perception of racialized faces or bodies as consequences of a neural threat system evolved that advantages the processing of survival threats. So in one case, it's phylogenetic. So when we see things like snakes and spiders, right, we understand those things are dangerous to us. On the other hand, some of it is ontogenetic, like guns and knives. So the idea of the black male being seen is seen as possessing these kinds of stimuli. It forces people to retreat to survival instincts. This is why Colin Brook and other people have found that mentioning black names or seeing black bodies, black male bodies, they're perceived as more aggressive, bigger, stronger, etc., comes naturally to many white Americans. We're not going to be able to speak our way or talk our way out of this. Next slide, please. So when we look at how racism operates, and this is a very important point, When we look at how racism operates in the United States, we're not just talking about a blind and generic hatred of all black people. What we see is the animation of very specific stereotypes of black people that are based on their fears of black men. Said differently, racist stereotypes of all black people is the application of stereotypes about black men to other black people. Now, this is an important point because it suggests to us that the fear of black people generally is driven by the fear they have of black men and boys. So racial and ethnic group stereotypes are largely determined by the conception that whites or dominant groups have of men of a racial or ethnic group rather than the views of women of said group. So throughout various populations in the United States, when whites tend to strongly associate traits of criminality and danger with black males rather than black females. Now, this is an important argument, important understanding for us when we're looking at liberal politics that are claiming that they're addressing and helping all black people. That means that white people can say that they help some groups of black people while ultimately still discriminating against or eliminating those they fear the most. And this is how many of our liberal progressive policies around gender operate, especially when we're talking about issues of masculinity. You can identify black boys as dangerous. You can identify black boys as rapists. You can say that they're predisposed to murder, aggression, and violence, but still remain progressive and accepted by society because you're helping other black people, be it women and girls, other sexual minorities. We have to understand that the relationship that whites have, their perceptions of danger, and the eliminations of that danger, fits within their view of progress. It fits in their view of liberalism. It fits in their view of gender advancement. So the specific attacks and institutions and ideas that we see affecting black men and boys directly project this kind of fear on them. And that's what rationalizes many of the policies, if not the direct threats that we see with police killings. So there's a strong relationship to perceptions of fear by black men and how whites interact with black men that they see. Next slide. The disproportionate target of black men and boys by police violence and mass incarceration has received renewed attention over the last decade. Social scientists have drawn attention to the disproportionate conviction of black men for lesser drug offenses compared to whites that create a black male underclass, and the fact that 1.5 million black men are missing either as a result of premature death or incarceration. The killing of black men and boys by police only adds to the lessening of this population and the skewed sex ratio of black men to women in the United States. From 2015 to January 30th of 2024, black men were roughly 96.5%, or 2,084 of the 2,160 black people killed by police. In their study on black mortality at the hands of police, Elwersley and Espiato found that black men are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police over life course than are white men. Black women are about 1.4 times more likely to be killed by police than are white women, but among all groups, black men and boys face the highest lifetime risk of being killed by police. Next slide, please. So police killings of black men and boys are not simply based on individual prejudice, but a deeply held belief or intuition that black men are threats. This chart shows you exactly what we're talking about in terms of the disproportionate risk and vulnerability that black men and boys have to lethal police intervention. There's not a debate when we look at the data and the facts about how black men and boys are engaged with lethal violence. There's not a debate about the kinds of lives, the kinds of vulnerability they have when put under threat by gun or the fear that whites have of them. But when we're reflecting on policy and discussions about black men and boys, somehow that disappears for academic jargon that privileges identity over the realities that are in front of us, right? We have a population that's being diminished, killed, and eliminated, incarcerated, taken out of society, simply because of how the white majority fears them and how they perceive what their potential can be. Next slide, please. Now, in a recent study by Ashley Plant, Goldman, and Kutzman, they found that even among college-educated white participants, there was a pronounced bias towards shooting black men, but a bias away from shooting black women and white in-group members. Plant, Goldman, and Kutzman also found that there was a pronounced bias away from shooting the female suspects even when they were armed. Specifically, when responding to black and white women, participants tend to make more mistakes of not shooting armed suspects than mistakenly shooting unarmed suspects. Next slide, please. So this study shows that even among white groups with college education, unarmed black men are thought to be more dangerous than white men or armed white or black women. This is how closely associated the idea of lethal threat and black men are in the minds of the dominant group. This is not something we could undo simply by making an argument. This requires policy intervention. It requires a very serious articulation of how racism actually functions. And that means that most of the theories that we actually have in the academy are simply not up to the task to explain this for us. It's not going to generate any kind of allegiance or compassion that we have or can have to this population. And if we truly, or we're being honest about racism, then we're not just talking about a mistake. We're talking about a system of beliefs that have been perpetuated, patterns of behavior and practice that are systematically designed to create certain and very specific outcomes in the society. And the elimination of black men and boys, along with other racialized male groups, is one of them. Next slide. Now, there are competing theories of how we understand black male targets. Next slide. The first theory that does this is social dominance theory. That was created by the late Jim Sedanius and his colleague, Felicia Pratt. Now, social dominance theory proposes a universalist system of in-group and out-group behavior. It suggests that you can have targeted groups of men based on race, class, religion, etc. And that this explains why lethal violence is one of the presumed and prevalent outcomes of how these racialized men are treated within Western democratic societies. Next slide. Black male studies, Black male studies, however, has a different view of the problem. Black male studies scholars are more interested in the specific consequences of racialization on males historically and sociologically. Next slide. So we talk a lot about anti-black misandry, are the cumulative assertions of black male inferiority due to errant psychologies of lack, dispositions of deviance, or hyperpersonality traits like hypersexuality and hypermasculinity, which rationalize the criminalization, phobics, and sanctioning of black male life. Now, this hatred of black men and racialized males generally are hidden beneath appeals to safety, civility, and democratic order, because he, the black male who is the phantasm of the boogeyman in the United States, is thought to be a threat to all that is good, white, and woman. Black male studies scholars are not simply just interested in dehumanization, next slide, but want to understand how stereotypes or caricatures of black men and boys actually motivate violence towards them. When we talk about the dehumanization of a specific group, we often do it descriptively. We are articulating a view that says that these people are viewed as lesser than or different from the dominant group. But the black male studies scholar is interested in what are the stereotypes, are the caricatures that are motivating violence, societal isolation, and death to be imposed on that group. So following some of the work of Smith, where he says that dehumanization acts as a psychological lubricant, dissolving our inhibitions and inflaming our destructive passions, empowering us to perform acts that would under normal circumstances be unthinkable. We're talking about the ways in which a whole population can justify the elimination of the other. What is it that has to be nullified or numbed among human beings, among groups, so that the murder of children becomes a necessary and rational part of how you want to preserve a society? What we're dealing with here is how the threats of black men and boys, how they're viewed that they are fundamentally at their core going to destroy American democracy, creates policies and practices that suggest that they're eliminating them is the only answer to that. Now, Goff's work suggested that dehumanization actually is a method by which individuals and social groups are targeted for cruelty, social degradation, and state-sanctioned violence. Next slide. So in The Man Not, what I wanted to do was understand how this process of dehumanization actually imposes itself on the black male population. Next slide, please. In The Man Not, I conceptualized the problem of black boyhood as an ontogenetic problem. In other words, it was a problem in the development of black boys' consciousness and their place in a world that was dedicated to their eradication. I understood from the negative demographic data that the black boy was denied potentiality in a future because the society was committed to preventing him from actually becoming an adult. So the consequences of being a black male child was inextricably tied to the societal violence that was imposed on black males writ large. That means the dehumanizing caricatures were seen as the end purpose of what the young black boy would be. And The Man Not articulated this as the black boy being killed as the cub before he becomes the nigger beast. And we have a very real reality to confront here. When we think about identity politics more generally, we're trying to fight for recognition. Far too often, academic prose and theory becomes a way to say that we're the most victimized or a specific group has not received the attention that it should receive. But none of the ideas of recognition or attention actually stop deaths. Being seen doesn't stop bullets, it actually enables them. And for oppressed populations within the United States, the association with deliberate acts of violence and being seen is too strongly tied together to simply ignore its rhetorical flourish. They see black men and boys. They recognize them as threats, and they recognize them as being undesirable to the overall project of white domination. The question we have to ask ourselves, both as scholars and practitioners, clinicians and activists, is how do we deal with the problem of people who will never be recognized as human beings? And we've run away from that. We have a history of black people and black intellectuals that understood that black people were being theorized as problems. This is what Du Bois was talking about in The Souls of Black Folk. This is what Du Bois was talking about in Darkwater. This is why black sociology, black psychology, black history were founded, because they understood that there had to be a reparative effort in the psychological and material consequences of white supremacy. This is why Fraser said that black intellectuals in America failed, because they were worried about the material benefits of discrimination rather than dealing with the direct confrontations and impacts of colonialism, the problem of creating the non-entity, the non-human, non-being. But we use that rhetorically. We'll claim that we're not seen, that we're not beings, but we don't deal with the consequences of not having a humanity and being viewed as subhuman. Next slide. So what we're dealing with here is a resistance of Eurocentric scholars, the white worldview, the white academy, call it whatever you will, to even acknowledge that forms of suicide could be related to the fatalist aspects of oppression. In his book on suicide, Emil Durkheim suggested that while we can conceptualize a notion of suicide that arises from absolute powerlessness and the kind of the interiorization of that, right, that was only historically interesting. It served no conceptual use for it. Now, Durkheim suggested to us that suicide, rather than being a form of insanity, was actually linked to social conditions. So he's one of the first sociologists that would probably suggest there were social determinants influencing how suicide occurred within Western societies. Next slide. However, this assumption that suicide was fundamentally due to some kind of fatalistic view of powerlessness was taken up by white researchers in the 1960s as a way to talk about a predetermined status of black people. So Herbert Hendon, for instance, wrote a book entitled Black Suicide in the 60s. And what he suggested was that the conditions that black people found themselves in, the anger, rage, and self-hatred that black men were experiencing, was incurable. He went so far as to suggest that the black power movements, the black civil rights movement, the black Muslim movement, while fancy, did not provide resources that ultimately increased the self-esteem and decreased the suicide ideation within the black male population. It was Huey P. Newton, however, that suggested that Hendon was wrong. Newton articulated a view of revolutionary suicide, where he said, we have to understand that the environmental conditions that breed self-hatred and negation are real. But he refused the idea that black men could not create hope in the view that they could overturn and fight against their oppressor. Now, the mistake that we've often made is that and I complain about this all the time, is that we only read black power texts as political treaties. We don't look at the conceptual and intellectual aspects that they're utilizing to refute previous white theory. Newton is making a political point, but he's also making one that's deeply rooted in psychology. He's suggesting that even in the midst of horrible conditions of oppression, black people can create positive value and hope. That even when dehumanized, black people can create positive attributes that they give to themselves. But this is not the way that we've traditionally associated or thought about suicide ideation in the black community. Next slide. When white researchers study black people, there's a predetermination of what those theories are going to look like. When we utilize their theories, we're going to get certain answers, and usually race falls out of it. In the first studies that were looking at black suicide in the 1970s, there was the idea that this was purely economic. James B. Stewart, of course, disagreed with that, as well as Lawrence Garrett. They believe that when you start looking specifically at the ways that black people suffered under white supremacy, we see two things. We see, one, the instability of the black home and family, often seen in the battle between the sexes, fathers, mothers, children, etc., within the home, that this was linked to higher suicide ideation, and according to James B. Stewart's work, the police. Now, the reason this is so important is because it's suggesting something to us. It's suggesting that it's the environment that black people find themselves in that's a product of white supremacy that's creating many of the stressors that are linked to suicide ideation. One of the major correlates are depression. So that means that in our study of black people, one of the ways that we have to understand this relationship is to start thinking about how negative social capital, the idea of danger, worthlessness, criminality, etc., are being interiorized by black populations and coming out as suicide ideation through depression. Next slide, please. So we know that suicide among black youth are increasing. Most of the data that we have from the CDC suggests this as well as the secondary literature, right? What I was personally shocked by is the finding that in the bottom, right? That black boys ages 5 to 11 are the only group where blacks have higher rates of suicide than whites. Now remember, this is in the midst of a problem where rates are increasing and you find higher rates of successful suicide attempts among black boys, because black males tend to use firearms in their suicide attempts, unlike their female counterparts. Now, people, over the last several years, I'm trying to say this nicely, without naming people. Over the last several years, black scholars in the United States have become more well recognized and regarded for their attempts to talk about racism and police violence after the murder of George Floyd. The success of BLM was in uplifting a very specific black academic class and was to the detriment of our communities. Because black boys, black men, poor black people were not saved by the awards that were given to a select few black people who were writing about race. So we are confronted with a reality where black theory and black thought that does not improve the lives of black people are seen as more worthy and worthwhile by white liberals than the attempts of black people to extend the life and improve the quality of life for black people in a racist society. That's not going to change. It's been this way for hundreds of years. But the insult to us, most specifically now, is that we are taught to rationalize the deaths of our children as the necessary currency for some people to have career advancement. Because it is on the back of poor black men and boys being killed. Their images being stained on streets in white chalk. Their images being circulated throughout social media as games and memes that people have built whole careers and sold books off. But they're not taking any serious time to reflect on what it means to lose a black boy's life. Any of these black boys could be geniuses that cure cancer, that find the way out of this problem of the United States. But we don't talk about black boys as a loss of potentiality. We talk about them as a loss of life for a moment, and then when the channel flicks or the video ends, that they're forgotten. They are framed by death, statistics, numbers. They're not talked about in terms of their life. Next slide. So when we look at these problems, right, 122% of injury increasing, fatal injury from suicide attempts. When we look at how the higher prevalence of whites generally suffering from depression and mental health issues is a well-known and documented fact through most of the epidemiological literature, but the worst outcomes of black boys and black people generally that suffer from mental health not being taken seriously still comes up over and over again as if this is not something that our communities deal with. And the fact that because black boys are thought to be threats, that they're thought to be aggressive, that these notions of dehumanization that we see in Goff's work and see articulated by Fisk are so dominant dominant cultural myths and logics within American society, black boys who are suffering from mental health issues and depression are perceived as being angry, aggressive, etc. So this is the lack of compassion that Fisk was talking about. That when we see black men and boys, we see threats, we see constructions and entities that have to be eliminated. We don't take the time to ask what's behind the behavior. Because whereas other groups get to say, well, why is he or she acting this way? What is wrong because they're better than this? When black boys act aggressively or angry, that's because that's who they are. That's what they're born to be, etc. This is the ontogenetic chasm that I'm talking about, right? When you think of a child developing to an adult, you think about those times that the child is unsatisfied, that anger and frustration and aggression emerge as natural progressions into selfhood. But for the black boy, he's trapped in savagery. He's trapped by a primitive state where his emotions cannot be regulated. And this is part of the racism, or what we talk about as misandric aggression within black male studies. Next slide, please. Now, some of the work with Shervin Asari, who I was fortunate to co-author a piece on this very issue with, announces or explains is that black boys and black men do not benefit from the natural, or what we think are natural protectors, or I guess socially determined protectors against suicide, ideation, and depression. So even when we control for education and class, we still see high levels of depression and suicide ideation among adult black men. And we see the same effect for young black boys. Now, I want y'all to think about this seriously. If we take the liberal myths of progress and democracy seriously, it suggests to us that as our life chances improve, as we better ourselves, those negative things associated with poverty and non-recognition disappear. What Asari's work suggests is, well, no, they actually endure. That for every year of education, every increase in socioeconomic status or the socioeconomic status bracket, racism among black men that the black male experiences endures. It doesn't lessen. And if it does, it's by a very small degree that's not comparable to the benefits other groups get. So we can't simply uplift ourselves out of this problem. Next slide. One of the most correlative predictors or factors of suicide ideation among young black youth is depression. Now, depression can stem from lots of different things. It's largely environmental in the case of black people, but it comes from external factors as well as internal ones. So instability in the home is certainly one of them. We have to think about the relationship that black children generally have in their own homes. Do they feel safe? Do they feel affirmed? Do they feel recognized? The other aspect is abuse. And this is where people get a little sensitive. Because when we talk about black parents and black homes, we want to fight against the racist insinuation that we're broken. But we have to analyze what's happening in these homes. Emotional abuse, physical abuse, child sexual abuse, too far away again, child sexual abuse are all issues that we have to deal with. And these are issues that disproportionately affect young boys and young men. We don't talk about their vulnerability to these kinds of things because we don't experience black boys as being capable to be harmed by anything other than bullets or the police. We don't think words hurt. We don't think slaps actually create intellectual or mental conditions of fragility. And this has to stop. Lastly, we see that Latif and his researchers, his colleagues found that much of the issue around depression within the black community for black boys is linked to a lack of compassion. The inability of us to see how this group is being treated, to recognize their actual struggles and ills. Next slide, please. So what ends up happening is that we emerge from a world where the black child has very few resources to existentially construct their being. We look at the black child as a finished product in our culture because of the way that racism pretty much allows us to see each and every one of us as a threat. We don't see the black boy as developing into a black man. And then asking ourselves, well, if we think that black men are trash or bullet bags, as people like to post on my timeline on Twitter, right? Well, then how do black men justify the positive growth into an adult? How does a young black boy anticipate and see joy in becoming a black man if the world fears him, if people in your own community fear him and says that he has no worth? Right? So the black boy then is forced to create humanity with few resources that have distant from the dominant mythology of black male deviance and danger. Next slide. So we have a few problems, right? The first problem is the self-hatred, the negation of blackness is an enduring and permanent part of white supremacist societies. I think if this decade has taught us anything, is that you cannot hope that white liberal sympathy will actually extend to improve black lives. No matter who's president, the condition of black people can and does worse as a group. So we should finally rid ourselves of the illusion that people that look like us will fundamentally contribute to the improvement of us, right? But that throws us back on very few resources or ideas to challenge these things. So the first that I want to talk about is how Adams and Thorpe suggested that we, of course, need more funding and research into the specific etiology of black male suicide. I think that goes without saying. They also suggested that we should create dedicated cultural competence on crisis hotline servers, right? There's been some efficacy showing that there is some prevention there. But overall, systematic reviews show that there's inconclusive data and programs that fundamentally solve this problem. Next slide. What we do know, though, is that we can mediate the effects of depression on black men and boys. The first thing we have to do is look at positive community programs. Lateef found that using concepts of Ubuntu and compassion decreased suicide ideation among young black males. This also is given to us, is shown to be an effective solution because in general, black men respond better to local community groups and mental health than clinical settings. So this puts a different burden on us because we know that white science and white medicine constantly misinterprets the condition that black people find themselves in. But it suggests to us that black communities can and do actually have an effect on the mental and psychological healing of our own people. But that creates an additional responsibility. So it means that the negative associations we have in our communities about black men and boys are directly linked to the suicide ideation and depression these black men and boys are experiencing. That's on us. So on the one hand, we celebrate that we can be healers, but we don't want to diagnose problems within our own community. The negative ideations, right, what we call anti-black misandry, runs rampant in our community. And we have not yet addressed that problem. Young black boys are consistently said to not hold academic potential compared to their female counterparts by black teachers and black mothers. That's our fault. If we're fighting for the lives of black boys against suicide, then we're also in a battle for their humanity among our own people. And that part of the problem hasn't been something that's been theorized or talked about because we're supposed to pretend that every black person with a PhD somehow automatically put together. That they're saying. And I can tell you as knowing these people, they're not. So that means that black people on the ground level have to start engineering a massive resocialization program. This is the same way that Carter G. Woodson talked about black history. We can talk about issues of domestic violence and child sexual abuse because black men are largely victims of that, just as black women are perpetrators. But we have to understand that that is a very small minority of our people who are in terrible conditions through poverty and segregation. That is not our whole people. So we need to stop using the minority to represent the whole. Last slide. Next slide, please. So in closing, I want to say that, look, we have the data, we have a long track record of how black men and boys are actually understood in the United States. We understand what are some of the social determinants that drive depression. We understand how suicide ideation actually works. Our problem is that we haven't taken action around that. because we don't want to confront the ways that we've internalized many of the stereotypes about black men and boys that white supremacists and the white nation has of them. If we're going to talk about any solution seriously, it requires us to not only re-socialize how we talk about black men and boys, but it requires us to think differently about how black men and boys actually function and live within our own communities and society at large. Dehumanization is not something that you simply think about or do because you have a different political stance. This is not about picking a new group of black people to put in the limelight. This is about fundamentally changing the way that we understand how black men and boys are attacked within American society, and the way that misandric aggression is a deliberate strategy to eliminate black men and boys on the path to eliminating the whole race. So thank you, and I'll open up for questions now. Yes. An easy formula. Easy access formula. Well, I think there's a few things, Cleo, and I think we discussed this. Thank you so much. I think we discussed this a little bit when we spoke before. We have to divest our community of the idea that they should fear black men and boys. We have to divest our community of the idea that black men don't function and that they're not a strong part of our success as a people in surviving to this point. I think we can see that the messages given to us by white liberals and the white Democratic Party would have us suggest that the only reason black people have anything worth slaving is because of black women and black Democrats. In order for us to change that, there has to be a grassroots movement by black teachers, activists, and community leaders to reformulate that story. And I'll be very specific in what I mean. We need to talk about black men's victimization, but we also need to talk about their vulnerabilities within communities. We need to talk about black men's successes in overcoming those things. How black men have historically sought for knowledge, that black men have used their platforms to build up other members of their community. They've hired black professors that were women. They used black families as research vehicles to change the narrative of what whites were saying about black people as a whole. They've been the first in line with life and limb to fight against white supremacy, even amid the loss of life. These stories are very much in the same vein that Woodson and Douglas said, the way that black history functions. That you're giving the people something to aspire to. You're creating heroes and heroines that see black men as being functional to the process of liberation and survival. That's not what we do today. Far too often on social media and within the academy, we take these, I don't even know how we make up these stories, but we take these views that somehow everything that a black man ever did was about gaining power and killing other people. We've lost the idea that black men protected families and communities. We've lost the idea that black men, I mean, when you look at people like Du Bois, look, these black men died penniless, without anything. They weren't rich or wealthy, but they created the reservoir of knowledge that we use still today to challenge many of the negative stereotypes and ideas. But we never talk about them as black men. We talk about them as Du Bois. Like, they're the exception. They're the exceptional Negro because we don't think generally black men are capable of that. When we talk about black civil rights leaders, X, B, and King, we talk about them as sexual perverts, right? We're more interested in their sexual history than what they've actually accomplished for black people and non-whites around the world. We talk about the Black Panther Party. We buy into this illusion created by Michelle Wallace and Gloria Steinem that says that they only wanted to dominate women. When they were traveling through China, they created breakfast clubs and ambulance services and free healthcare. You know, the evidence of what their lives were about doesn't match up to the narrative and the cliff notes we're told to insist about. Imagine if we talked about the Black Panther Party as creating and inspiring black psychology. Imagine if we talked about black nationalism as not simply being a political movement that was killed and crushed by the FBI and CIA, but as increasing the intellectual capacity of black people to start thinking about how black consciousness and blackness operated within a white supremacist society. Because all the leaders that we think about, from Derek Bell to Sylvia Winter, were inspired by black nationalists and Pan-African movements, not by these ideas of black liberalism and black progressivism, because they knew that those things would fall short. But we're constantly inculcating people with the idea that whites and black academics who are white adjacent can determine our histories, despite the fact that they're not actually, those histories are not in the archive, right? We have to move away from that. And in far too many activist spaces, we see people imitating what they hear from the academy without paying close attention to what's happening in our communities. I find it preposterous that you can't look in our communities and find black men who are victims of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. I know that's not the truth. That's not the case because they reach out to me all the time. I know it's not the case because when I was young, I saw it actually happen. So why is it that when we frame questions of what our community can do to help people, we don't address those issues that we know are so prevalent within our homes and households? It requires us to have a different kind of conversation. Now, that's not to let white supremacy off the hook in any way, but it's to understand that if we're trying to improve the condition of our people, we have to be honest about what's actually producing depression and other, comorbidities, so to speak, that are leading us towards suicide and suicide ideation. Oh, okay. You don't want me to answer it again for the benefit of the lives, do you? Yeah, sure. Sure, not a problem. Mm-hmm.
Brothers and sisters, family and friends, thank you for asking some of these brilliant questions. Let me just make sure that we capture this.
Oh, Spike Lee. Okay, all right.
Please repeat that question. He's not going to repeat the answer again, but we want everybody to make sure we knew what he was answering.
All right, that's difficult when you speak from inspiration and not a written script. But the question, I believe, was, please help provide a user-friendly, accessible formula to change or transform how people tend to see black males. I'll say quickly that it's my experience that as soon as people lay eyes on a black man or a black boy, unconsciously they get to dehumanizing, de-dimensionalizing, lessening the value, and it's all unconscious, which is why I asked for a user-friendly formula, because I'm telling you, as a person who looks like a black man and is treated like that, people don't even know they're doing what they're doing, that they're doing what they're doing, what they're doing. And as you know, it's become so acculturated and normalized and intellectualized and emotionalized that people don't even notice the tears and the blood flowing from a black male body. So how do we reverse that tendency?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for that answer, Dr. Curry. I think you got another hand. I'm going to let you.
Thank you, Dr. Curry, because what you broke down and expounded upon was profound and really informing a lot on what a lot of us do in the community. So my question is, Dr. Bobby Wright wrote an essay, I think in 81, 82, before he passed, called Black Suicide, Lynching by Another Name. And in there, he conceptualized that suicide is amongst black males is not really suicide, but an orchestrated homicide by white dominant culture. Can you speak to that? Yes, sir.
I'm a big fan of Wright's work. It was actually introduced to me in some of my first Afrocentric psychology courses. Let me begin by saying that it's difficult not to speak to what I think Wright communicates, because I think what he's communicating is true. I think it's hard to test the pathways that lead to that. And let me explain why. Wright is suggesting to us that the way that white supremacy operates is to create forms of menticide that are internalized within the black population. He says that the alienation process that black people experience by being in a white supremacist society means that they can't have positive images or positive social capital that develops into an optimal or more optimal worldview. So I think that what black psychologists and Afrocentric psychologists have been trying to point out is that there's always a level of maladjustment in the black in a black psychological personality, given how white supremacy operates. In the academy, if people were reading Sylvia Wynter more carefully, she's making that same argument in her sociogenetic principle when she's talking about this problem of black consciousness, right? But it's difficult to diagnose that because what we're talking about is an external locus, right? Creating the conditions that lead black men and boys and black people generally, right, to kill themselves given the oppressive societal condition. So the solution, and this is why I said solutions and then mediating, right, practices, right, strategies. You can't make a non-racist white society. So the endurance of white supremacy, beyond the rhetorical flourishes of people don't treat me correctly, is that you are trying to create populations that do not perform, don't perform economically, do not have the same kind of population yield as the dominant white race. Racism is trying to create the conditions where white stocks or the dominant racial stock outperform other racial groups on every demographic category. That's how they stay in power. So what Wright's explain is the societal dynamic by which that happens. If I don't have to have a spectacle lynching, but I can create enough self-hatred and self-negation that you want to take care of the job for yourself, then that is a function of the oppressive white society and systemic anti-black racism, not the insanity or maladjustment of the individual. The society produces the psychological maladjustment, right? So I agree with Wright. The problem is, if we link the external locus of white supremacy to that outcome, that's an unchanging aspect of what happens as long as we live in white supremacist society. We can hope to mediate it, right? Lessen that effect. But if that's the design of the society, that is what the society is going to try to do. And the irony is that we understand this when we're talking about other populations. So when you look at the intimate partner violence data and the systemic reviews on stigmatization versus antisocial behavior, suicide, depression among, LGBTQ populations or white LGBTQ populations in the United States, we readily admit that societal stigmatization leads to these negative outcomes. But when it's black people, we don't attend to it that way. We talk about depression and why home life may not be correct or why people may not be recognized, but we don't talk about it as a deliberate product of the way that the system and the way that the institutions are set up. So institutional racism becomes a descriptor, right? Oh, well, we know that that's institutionally racist, but we don't study racism as creating conditions, ideologies, beliefs, etc., that try to produce certain outcomes in the mind of the oppressed. And this is really part of the dereliction and the shame of so many black academics who appropriate people like Fanon, but don't understand that this is exactly what Fanon was talking about in the North African syndrome, right? Fanon is talking about it. The whole point of Black Skin, White Mask is what happens when the self internalizes the view of the dominant white French society and the negative stereotypes about the Negro in learning French language and constructing a self-identity. But then we don't apply this very same logic when we say, well, in a black American society where black men are thought to be criminals, rapists, thieves, and worthless, what happens when you internalize that view and how do you live a life that's optimal given that everything about what you know about the world negates who you are? So what we've done is we've said we have high-performing Negroes. They could read, write, and talk about things. And that's an indication of social health because the only metrics that we really use about self-identity are the people who work in white institutions. But when you look at black neighborhoods and you ask, well, why is there violence? Why is there poverty? Why is there alcoholism, et cetera? We don't treat the way the systems have created these issues, right? What we do is we say the people who have social mobility that escape those issues, there's a success and everybody else doesn't deserve to live. And I have a problem with that. I have a fundamental problem that black academics largely on the back of white philanthropists and white liberals, are being told that there's whole categories of black people that we shouldn't care about because they didn't lift themselves up by the bootstraps through white liberal support, of course, into academic and other professional, employment opportunities. So we should just forget about them. It's what Du Bois. It's the most disadvantaged and the worst of us. They require us to do the most work to rehabilitate our race. This is why, and this is classes, but I understand where their hearts were. This is why those men's and women's clubs in the 19th century were so important. Because, they would go in and teach people how to cook healthy and how to clean properly to not spread disease, right? We're not in that situation now, but it's the idea that if we're gonna rise up, we have to rise up together. Their mistaken view is they thought it was the middle class and the educated people that were gonna lead the race. Our problem is that, look, no matter how much progress we think we make, we end up in the same place. The conversations that we're having today under Kamala Harris is the same conversations we had before Obama was elected and when Trump came into power. So at some point we have to understand that our oppression is not just about our political position. It's about the overall status and health of our communities and about the ways that we perceive ourselves. And white people have done a very good job of suggesting that there's no real value in being defined as black, and that we are better defined ourselves as something else. So we could be poor, we could be gay, we could be Christian, we could be whatever. Anything but black has value in this society politically as an identity. So what we've done is we've said, hey, you don't have any resources to construct yourself. You can't be a man because that's just patriarchal. You can't be black because that's just non-human. So that double negation, right, of your identity status is something that we're not caring about, right? And what we end up doing is trying to diagnose problems without looking at conditions and circumstances. So we blame the individual, or we blame the group of individuals for not caring about education or not caring about their success or only caring about money without looking at what that view does to pull them out of the circumstances they're trying to escape.
I think we have a few more questions. I see one in the back. I see one in the front. I see another in the front. I see another. So we got a total of 4 questions. We want to make sure that we get all of our questions answered. I got you. And so we want to make sure we get all of our questions answered. Are we getting full today? I feel like I need to pop the top button. We eating good. Okay, here comes another one.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. At 2 o'clock today, I'm going to jump out and come back. I'm going to meet with the chief of schools for Montgomery County Public Schools. On next Thursday, we will be meeting with the new superintendent. For those who don't know Montgomery County Public Schools, 160,000 students, over 200 schools, 105 languages, 32,000 black children. The only time they disaggregate what's happening between black boys and black girls is when we talk about discipline, not when we talk about academics. Less than 2% of the teachers are black men. My question to you, and you might not be able to answer on the spot, and to all of you, please send your answers. What do you want me to say at 2 o'clock to the white man who leads all of the schools, and on next Thursday to the superintendent over this whole district? What do we extract? What should they keep doing, stop doing, start doing to address the things that you have raised? Anybody can send an answer, but 2 o'clock I'm going, and I'm going to give them your script and this agenda and say you should have been here.
Well, of course, a difficult question given I don't know the specifics of Maryland school districts. But let me ask you a question, right? Because I do know the national data. Like, is part of the issue black boy suspension when you talk about discipline, expulsion, disproportionately special education? Right, okay, so, you're right. Well, there you go, right? All right. So, look, there's a few things, okay? There's a few things. One is that we certainly need to increase black male teachers. We know that there's a significant effect on role perception from the literature, both in terms of learning and in terms of discipline, right? The other thing that we need to do, though, is that we have to change the way that they interact and service black men and boys. The reason that I started off with the data on dehumanization and threat construction is because those are the relevant and dominant cultural scripts that whites use in interacting with black men in multiple contexts. So the idea that black men and boys are by nature deviant or criminal, et cetera, are things that we actually see happening within school systems. That's why there's such a strong relationship between things like special education, right, class level, like AP classes, et cetera, and then dropouts and the prison pipeline. So we have to build in structures, we need to build in services, and we need to build in community groups that are going to hold those entities and institutions accountable to changing how black boys are seen. Concrete example, what kind of cultural competence or diversity training are those people taking that specifically deal with the stereotypes about black men and boys? How are we actually having people like a counselor within the school that's actually familiar with how black men and boys are being treated, both within the school system and in large society, that's reflecting within the classroom? What kind of black social worker or black psychologist do we have that's actually trained in black psychology and black social work that's addressing the kinds of issues that black boys are experiencing with anger, with depression, et cetera? The issue is increasing services and the kinds of communities that can support positive self-ideation within that population, within school systems. Now, in terms of how we deal with white people, that's a different issue, because what we're dealing with largely with a white female teacher population is the fears and stereotypes that they have of these young black men and boys that they code as safety or code as their professional opinion, right? So there needs to be a very specific kind of training or a very specific intervention on behalf of the community that's going to hold white women accountable for how they're perceiving young black boys and how they want to punish them for them not behaving or not listening to their authority, right? But offhand, that's what I would suggest. I think as a larger context, let me just say this last thing. I think as a larger context, we have to start utilizing the black community to police the kind of education we get within our own neighborhoods. Far too often, and I see this all the time on social media, and for the life of me, I don't understand. You see so many black people rejecting what black academics have to say about black people and black children and black families. And somehow that doesn't matter for how black academics are perceived or rewarded. And I've never seen a group that is being told by the people that they allegedly speak for and study, being told they're wrong and it have no effect. So black communities have to start holding people accountable for what they are in fact saying about themselves, right? And that's something that we're not doing. And I mean, that goes through to activist circles where they're utilizing people like bell hooks that thinks black boys are, deviant, dominant sexual predators. We have to challenge that stuff. And we need community groups to spread the word that this is not the way we want to look at our children.
Excellent. I think how many, we got 1, 2, 3, and we need to ask Dr. Curry to do something that he's not used to doing, is brevity, because we're gonna land this plane. We got more food for you to eat. Okay, so we're gonna.
This conversation leads right into what I wanted to talk about. In Maryland, we just passed a crime bill that you spoke about earlier that will send our 10, 11, 12, 13, our young black boys, mostly, into our broken criminal justice system. How did that happen? I advocated for it not to happen with other groups. But when I went into my community and I talked to my seniors, when I went into the corner stores and I talked to my neighbors, just what you said is happening. We have begun to feed into the notion that our young black men are just what they're being portrayed to be. And that's not true. But I found that they need to go, you have to do something with them. They need to go to jail. They broke into my car. They did this, they did that. Not recognizing that a lot of our young black men are angry. They're angry because they have not been educated. They have not been taught to read at 10 years old. They're still not reading on grade level. Would you go to school after you were 10 years, would you go to middle school if you couldn't read on a 3rd grade level? No. You're going to not go to school. You're going to drop out. You're going to stand on the corner. So we have to start in the schools, and we have to make sure that we ourselves don't feed into the notion that our kids are criminals, that our kids are naturally born predators. We don't have to. So my question is, how do I make sure that we got enough ammunition to fight this? How do I make sure that when I talk to these people, I say to them, no, that's not who my young grandson is. That's not who your grandson is. And how do we get those resources? We got a few programs, but how do we get those resources to actively do what they're supposed to do in our communities? Because we're failing. We failed by having that bill passed.
So I think two things. One, I think that community organizations have to create an outreach with communities to teach them this kind of research. Right? Black academics have historically worked with black communities, and we're not doing that now. So we need to start creating mechanisms like with Racial Justice Now, where academics can come in and actually talk about the concrete research to better educate the community about why they think what they think and why certain policies are being passed.
Hi, so I have a two-part question. I was wondering if you had Sankofa in mind when you were discussing your mediating strategies and solutions, and in what ways can we incorporate African cultural infrastructure and practices as diasporic Africans? Because like some of the things that you mentioned about like the community support and not necessarily like the clinical setting made me think immediately of like pre-colonial traditional practices that we had in place that we don't understand that we've lost through the transatlantic slave trade and colonization. We don't realize that part of the reason that we have some of the disparities and illnesses in our community is because we have practices and ways of living that addressed our mental, physical, spiritual, every aspect of ourselves and affirmed our humanity and our connection to each other. And we don't realize that that's a big missing piece of the puzzle. So in what ways as diasporic Africans can we incorporate that knowledge and reclaim it?
So I always think about Sankofa, right? And, briefly I'll say that what we often do is, academics, is we romanticize a concept or a rhetoric without actually applying it. We need to remember how our struggles and where we come from is a sign of resilience and endurance that not many races in the world can claim. There are whole groups of people that no longer exist, and our people survive. That being said, we also have to do the new work, and we have to charge our black academics, clinicians, doctors, etc., with coming up with solutions to these problems. One of the things that I think often happens is we reach back without understanding how reaching back should influence how we think today. So the fact that we know that black people have hesitancy towards white clinical environments should inform us something about the way that cultural mistrust tries to protect us from dangers from the dominant group. That's not necessarily a problem. The absence of the services are a problem, but not trusting the people who oppress you to deliver those services is probably a good idea. So what we have to do then are create community-based or black-based clinicians and institutions that can deliver those services to our people, right? Those are strategies that people all around the world have used. It seems alien for us because the dominant view of black people becoming liberated was shoved down our throats as integrationism and assimilation. So when we have conversations about, well, what can we do or what are our practices, it almost seems alien to us because we have to rediscover them. And then we want to lock them in the framework that says, well, that's what we did before colonialism, that works now. We don't know if that's actually going to be the case. We have to test it, right? So our black thinkers have to say, here's a practice, let's test if it works. If it doesn't work, not useful for this context, what works, right? We have to constantly improve ourselves in that way. So I would say, yes,
we can reach back, but we have to be very specific and careful about what we claim actually solves problems. Because we have people that we have to negate these outcomes. We have to improve the conditions of black men and boys in terms of suicide and self-conception and depression before we can even start having conversations about how we get to optimality.
Brothers and sisters, family and friends, put your hands together for Tommy J. Curry, our doctor. We appreciate you.